Welcome everybody to this information session on GW's Master of Arts program in Environmental Resource Policy. I want to take about 20 minutes to give you an overview of the program and some of its features. At the end of the session, I'll provide you with some contact info about how to get answers for any additional questions you might have. By way of introduction, my name is Peter Linquiti. I am the director of the program, and I'm also an associate professor of environmental policy here at GW. I come to the academic world in a slightly non-traditional way. I initially got my master's in public policy about 25 years ago and spent the intervening time as a consultant doing work in environment and energy policy for clients like EPA, the World Bank, the Department of Energy, and several foreign governments that were doing projects under the auspices of the World Bank. And then mid-career, I came back to the academic world to get my PhD, and I have been here at GW the last few years and responsible for the ENRP program, as we call it. Just to give you a quick snapshot of what we're going to be talking about, the MA program was established in the early 1990s. We have a couple hundred alumni at this point. The program comprises 36 credits of academic study, which equates to 12 courses that you'd take as part of the MA program. 8 of those courses are required for our electives. If you attend school on a full-time basis, you would be taking 3 courses per semester, meaning that it will take you 4 semesters to complete the program, and if you skip the summer session, that means it's going to take 2 academic years to get through the program. We do have several students who come to us on a part-time basis. They take 1 or 2 courses per semester, and depending on how many courses they take in any given year, it may take them 3 or 4 years to complete the program. We are fully supportive of part-time students. All of the courses are offered here on campus in downtown DC in a neighborhood called Foggy Bottom, just a few blocks away from the White House. Before diving into the nuts and bolts of how the program actually works, you may find it useful if we step back and ask the question, what exactly are we trying to do in the program? What's our view of environmental policy? And I think that will actually give you a better sense of what the program is all about. So we start with the premise that environmental policy operates in the context of at least 2 sets of systems. Environmental policy is very much influenced by human systems, so the economy, the political system, the system of governance, the social and cultural norms that guide how we treat the environment. Then, of course, there is the natural world, the physical and biological and ecological systems that comprise the natural environment. And so we aspire to give our students an understanding of both sets of systems because both are very important to successful environmental policy. Intellectually, the challenge gets even more complicated because there are several linkages between these 2 sets of systems. In the simplest sense, the natural system provides us, as a society, lots of resources that we use, whether it's timber or fish from fisheries or oil and gas and coal. But we pull resources from the natural world and put them to use in human systems. And then, of course, we often use the natural environment as the sink, the dumping ground for a lot of the wastes that come from human activity. And the reason it's important that our students not only understand each of the sets of systems and then the linkages between them is because ultimately what we're doing with environmental policy is we are parachuting down into this collection of systems policy interventions. And if we hope to have the desired results from those interventions, from those policies that we put in place, we have to start with a clear and accurate understanding of how those systems actually work. If we don't understand how they work, then it seems to me we have very little chance of success. So to make those concepts a little more concrete, I thought it would be useful to show you here just what we mean when we talk about issues of environmental policy. These would be the kinds of things that you'd be able to study while you're here at GW and improve your skills and abilities with respect to making more effective policy interventions in the domains that you see listed here. One last point I'd like to make about the intellectual framework, the intellectual foundation for the program before we turn to the specifics, is that what we're trying to develop in our graduates is the ability to apply what we call whole sight to environmental challenges, meaning that due to their complexity, environmental challenges can be different things to different people. And no one particular way of looking at the challenge is inherently superior to another. And that to make effective environmental policy, we need to be able to see those environmental challenges in what we call a panoptic or a multi-lens perspective. There are typically 8 lenses that we think are important, that you need to be able to look through to understand an environmental challenge. Maybe to just illustrate with a very quick example, there are lots of folks who feel that our reliance on coal as a source of fossil fuel energy for electric power generation is troublesome. It's certainly the case that from a scientific point of view, burning coal for electricity emits more CO2 per kilowatt hour generated than some of the alternative fuels that are out there. At the same time, there is a long historical pattern of using coal to fuel economic development. In addition, we have potential technologies, perhaps carbon capture and sequestration, that could reduce the environmental impacts of coal use. We also need to remember that there are many communities here in America and elsewhere around the world where coal production is pretty much the sole economic activity. And if the world radically reduces its use of coal, we will have significant economic impacts in these communities, many of which are deeply impoverished. And we have then a kind of a human impact issue associated with reducing coal usage. You might also think about how fracking, setting aside what you feel about the environmental impacts of fracking, it's incontestable that fracking has led to much lower natural gas prices, and spontaneously through market forces, power plants have been substituting natural gas for coal, and coal use is falling because of the economics of the situation. Finally, when it comes to government, of course, we're looking at a whole range of public policies that might be put in place to affect the fuel mix that's used for power generation. So that's just a quick example, the issue of coal and its environmental consequences, of how using this panoptic multi-lens approach can give you whole sight, can give you a much deeper appreciation of understanding the environmental challenge. And again, it's our firm belief that if you want to make effective public policy in the environmental arena, you need to see the whole challenge. If you only see part of the challenge, your proposed solutions are inevitably going to come up short. With that broad conceptual foundation in place about what we're trying to do in the program writ large, I'd like to pivot now and drill down, if you will, a bit on the specifics of how the program actually works. As I mentioned earlier, there are 8 required courses in the curriculum and 4 electives. So let's talk quickly about the required courses. We think that environmental sciences are incredibly important to sound environmental policy, and that's why we have a 2-semester sequence, the first of which focuses on the physical sciences, the chemistry, if you will, the physics of the natural world, how pollution behaves in the environment, how the climate is responding to greenhouse gas emissions, ocean currents, that sort of thing. In the second semester, we pivot to the life sciences, and there we're picking up biology and ecology and toxicology and human health impacts that are associated with many of the environmental insults, if you will, to the natural world. So 2 semesters of environmental science. We think that economics is a particularly useful tool for understanding the human set of systems that affect the environment. So you're taking a microeconomics course followed by an environmental economics course. There are then a pair of courses in the public policy program that give you the foundation in research methods and statistics and in policy analysis methods. I personally teach PPPA 6006, where we go over a sort of a standard paradigm that we find is very useful for breaking down and solving public sector problems. And then finally, because at least in the United States, environmental policy is highly driven by statutory and regulatory policies, it's very important that our students have a deep appreciation of environmental law. And so in this course, you're going to cover things like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is the driving force behind the environmental impact statement process. We'll cover the Clean Air Act, which is being used in the U.S. not only for local air quality management, but also to address climate change. You get into the Clean Water Act, and so forth. So we really want to make sure you have this set of courses that help you develop that whole site we were talking about just a minute ago. Now, I said there were 8 core courses. You'll see that there are only 7 listed here. So the 8th required course is the Capstone course. It's a class that I personally teach as well. In many master's programs, you'll find a thesis requirement or a comprehensive exam requirement. We don't have either. What we have instead is the requirement that you engage in a semester-long project for an external client in the field of environmental policy. It's a group project where you would work with 2 or 3 other classmates to execute the project. As I mentioned, it's client-driven, and the student group is free to choose its own client. We have had students do work for EPA, for the District of Columbia's Department of Environment, also for the Department of Energy here, the National Department of Energy, as well as a wide range of non-governmental organizations. Now, we do require that the capstone truly be an analytic project. You're not engaged in advocacy work to substantiate a foregone conclusion. We really need to have the conclusion be something that's in doubt before the project has begun, and then the research that you guys do in your capstone project resolves that doubt and gives us some sort of an analytically based answer. You meet as a class and as a group with the instructor. So when I say we meet as a class, that means that you're in the classroom with students other than your immediate group mates, if you will. So you will actually need to come up the learning curve about the other 3 or 4 projects that are going on in the same semester that you're taking capstone, and make an intellectual contribution to those projects as well. Of course, your biggest contribution will come to your own capstone project, and we do tell students to expect to spend about 10 hours a week over the course of the semester, so maybe about 150 hours per person. So when you do the math, capstone projects entail 300 to 500 hours of effort on behalf of your client. So I encourage our capstone students to really be proud about the contribution they're making to their client and recognize the value of what's actually being provided to the client. You have to include primary data collection in your capstone project. We're not a field sciences oriented program, so you're not going out there collecting water or air samples. Most of the data collection entails interviewing people, stakeholders that are relevant to the project you're doing, but on a case-by-case basis, you can work out other forms of data collection. The end product is a 35-page report with maybe 20 pages of technical appendices. Then you make a presentation to faculty here at GW, and a portion of your grade, in fact, for the capstone class depends on the grades that are assigned by these faculty in that actual at the end of that actual presentation. You're also required to present your project to the client although nobody from GW is present then with you, but it is intended to give you the experience that you'll find is very typical in the professional world, that after you've done a piece of analytic work, you then present it to your client. So in addition to those 8 required courses, you also take 4 electives. You can take those electives at virtually any school or department within GW, the law school, the business school, the engineering school, for example. GW also participates in a consortium of universities here within DC, Georgetown, George Mason, Catholic, University of Maryland, College Park, Howard University, and you're able to take courses there if what you're looking for doesn't happen to be offered at GW. We find that students usually take one of 3 approaches to selecting their electives. Some students decide to go deep in one subject and ensure that all 4 electives relate to a particular environmental policy topic. So if you're really interested in climate change, maybe you take an additional science course on the atmospheric chemistry that's driving climate change. Maybe you take a course over in the Elliott School of International Affairs on the international negotiations. Maybe you do additional work related to energy and how energy consumption affects climate change. As another example, you might choose to go deep in urban sustainability, where you try to master the economics of urban communities. Perhaps you're also looking at green infrastructure and cities' efforts to build more transit-oriented development so that retail, employment, and entertainment are all in the same area, requiring much less energy consumption on transportation. So one option is to go deep in a single subject. Another option for your electives is to simply go broad and look at the course catalog every semester, see what's offered, and take whatever strikes your fancy. And we do have a lot of students do that. And at the end of the program, they say they're happy with the fact that they know a little bit about several different subjects. A third approach to selecting electives is to think about tools that are going to be particularly important in a career setting. So we have lots of students taking courses in geospatial information systems, GIS, because more and more we find that thinking about environmental policy requires us to think about how pollution, for example, moves across the surface of the earth and how it does so over time. And GIS tools are great at helping you understand and analyze those kinds of phenomena. Other folks go deeper in economics with additional work in cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis tends to be prospective prior to the implementation of a policy. There's a bookend or parallel analytic framework called program evaluation, where we systematically look at programs that have been implemented and try and figure out how to make them work better. There are also quantitative skills in econometrics and decision sciences that some students choose to enhance with their choice of electives. Once you're done with the program, what happens? Where do our alumni end up working? A large fraction of the ENRP graduating class takes a job in the public sector, working for government, either at the federal, state, or local level. We have about a quarter of our students working in the for-profit sector, but you'll find if you drill down on that statistic that many of those graduates are working for consulting firms for whom the client is actually a government agency. So that actually is a good example of what I did in my career. I spent 20 years, as I said, at ICF International, and virtually all of that time was spent working for clients in the public sector. So even though I had a private sector job, I was working on public policy issues. Then we also have a lot of students in nonprofit organizations, either doing advocacy work on behalf of the environment or more sort of think tank research types of projects. So switching gears from what happens to students after they leave the program, let's talk about students before they enter the program. What kinds of undergraduate backgrounds do our incoming students have? Well, the first thing to recognize is that we don't have a required program of undergraduate study. We will basically accept students from any undergraduate major. We typically have students coming to us with a couple of years of work experience, although on either end of the spectrum, about a quarter of our students come directly from their undergraduate program. Another quarter of the students come to us from more than 3 or 4 years worth of work experience. I would say that you do need to have a certain proficiency with math skills, both in the science classes, the statistics classes, and as well the economics classes. You're going to be using math kind of equivalent to college level algebra. No calculus is used in the required courses, but if you're not comfortable with analytic geometry, pre-calculus, or college level algebra, you're going to struggle a little. So you may want to make sure you've picked up that expertise either in a college course or in some sort of a refresher that you might do before you actually enter the program. You can waive some of the required courses if you have a really strong undergraduate track record in a particular field. So for example, you might be able to waive ENRP 6102, which is the environmental sciences course focused on the life sciences, if you were a biology major. On the other hand, if you took one biology class as a freshman or a sophomore, that's not going to be enough for you to waive the course. Typically, we're looking for 2 or 3 courses as an undergrad in the field that's covered by our required course. We're looking primarily for junior and senior level courses in which you got at least a B. And if you don't meet those requirements, we're probably going to ask you to take the course here as a master's student. In addition to the curriculum itself, I'd like to point out another distinctive feature of the ENRP program, and that's our location here in Washington, D.C. And I really don't think it's an exaggeration to say that D.C. is the hub of environmental policymaking, at least in the United States. Every federal agency that has anything to do with the environment has its headquarters here in D.C. We recently counted up and found over 75 environmental NGOs, non-government organizations, across the ideological spectrum operating here in D.C. There are a number of think tanks in the environmental arena that are based in D.C. Of course, we have all the branches of government, Congress, the Supreme Court, and the White House. And what that means to you as a student practically is you can have a front row seat on environmental policymaking that you cannot get in cities anywhere else in the U.S. So one of the assignments you might find in the environmental law class is to go sit and listen to oral arguments being made at the Supreme Court about a Clean Air Act case. You can't do that outside of D.C. Probably the premier think tank in the environmental arena is Resources for the Future. They hold a monthly session. It's called the First Wednesday Session. At lunchtime, that's about an hour and a half, and they have some of the most prominent environmental speakers come to talk to an audience. It's an open session. Anyone can go, and you even get a free lunch. And it's a great opportunity for ENRP students to hear about the cutting-edge ideas in environmental policy. As one example, they had the administrator of EPA, Gina McCarthy, come and give a presentation about the Clean Power Plan to give an insight that I don't think you could get anywhere else. In addition, you should know that virtually all of the required courses have evening sections that'll start at 6 or 7 in the evening. So if you did have an internship at one of these organizations here in DC, it wouldn't interfere with your schoolwork. Although I would say if you're attending class full-time, taking 3 courses per semester, you really shouldn't count on working more than about 20 hours a week. Speaking about working, it reminds me a little bit about the important subject of tuition. Like higher education in general, a master's degree here at GW is not particularly inexpensive. There are 36 required credit hours. I'm approximating a $1,600 per hour rate. I need to add the disclaimer that the Board of Trustees sets the tuition. They have not set the tuition yet for the 16-17 academic year. Of course, they have not also set the tuition for the following year. But approximately $58,000 or so would be a good benchmark number for you to think about when you're thinking about the cost of tuition. We do offer financial support. There are merit-based fellowships that are available. Typically, they'll cover about half the tuition, and they'll go to the top 10 or 20% of the applicants. I don't know if I mentioned it, but you should know that the incoming class is typically between 12 and 20 students. In addition, as a big university, GW also participates in all the need-based programs. So if you can demonstrate financial need, you will be eligible for subsidized loans and work study. There are also lots of job opportunities in Washington, D.C., being a big, generally economically prosperous metropolitan area. You may not have too much trouble finding a job if that's what you'd like to do. ENRP itself does not have a set of positions that it is able to offer graduate students, but graduate students are often able to find positions working for GW, doing research or other kinds of support activities. When it comes to the calendar and some important dates to keep in mind, if you're interested in joining the program in the fall of 2016, we need to see your application by February 1st. If you're interested in fellowship support. Otherwise, April 1st is the deadline. If you want to enter in spring of 2017, we would need to see your application by October 15th. We don't have too many hard and fast minimum requirements for admission. By virtue of university policy, we don't admit anybody to our graduate programs with an undergraduate GPA of less than 3.0. GRE test scores are important. I know there are lots of good arguments about over-reliance on test scores, but I have to say frankly that when it comes to evaluating applications, it can be very difficult to compare GPAs from different universities. When we see a 3.8 from one school and we're comparing it to a 3.2 at another school, we don't know really anything about the rigor of the school in general, the rigor of the specific classes that were taken, the degree to which the student challenged themselves by taking difficult classes versus playing it safe and taking only classes where they knew they'd get a high grade. And the one thing I will say about the GRE test score is that I know that if you took the test 3 years ago in Southern California or you took it 2 weeks ago in New York, I can compare two applicants using a common metric. Now, we will ignore GRE test scores if there are high GPAs, great recommendations, and great personal statements. We really do read the applications holistically. We're not that big a program. We're not getting thousands of applications every year, so we do have the ability to take a more nuanced and individualized approach to reading applications. That's really all I wanted to cover in this information session. If you have questions, we would be happy to try and answer them. A lot of great information is on our website. You can email us at enrp@gwu.edu, or you can follow us on Twitter. So again, hopefully this information session has answered most of your questions, but anything that remains unanswered, certainly feel free to get in touch with us and we'll do our best to help you out. Thanks very much, and I hope to see an application from you at some point in the not too distant future.